any standardization effort will not be able to keep up with that pace, with that scientific pace, right?
The following is a conversation with Richardus Vonk. Richard is a former VP at Bayer who's got over 30 years experience in clinical drug development. He's incredibly passionate about innovating in the space, and I've been trying to get him on the podcast for a while. So I'm super excited that he decided to join for today's episode. And some of the things we talk about are super interesting. I think there's several that I could think of, but in particular, what took my interest were how do you build a culture of innovation in a large pharma? And how do you balance the difficulties between, on the one hand, trying to take risks, but on the other hand, appreciating that, well, lives are at stake. And we also talk about the tactical versus strategic use of AI. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Have a listen and let us know what you think. Bye-bye. Richard, I'm super excited to speak with you today. We've known each other for, it's been a while now. And I've always been interested in your, I guess, more visionary approach to what is a slightly more conservative part of drug discovery. So I'm super happy for you to share some of the thinking you have. And I think a lot of people, especially some of the leadership particularly, have a lot to learn from you on how to not just, I guess, think about innovation in statistical programming, but actually implement it. So just for the benefit of our listeners, would you mind sharing with them a little bit how you ended up doing what you do? And So
basically, I've been in statistics all my life, right? As I embarked on the journey at Bayer oncology, one of the challenges I must say I had is that I was also leading a function, medical writing. And I was looking at the way they worked, and I had to learn a lot, of course, right? Because I know quite a lot about statistics and programming and data management, not so much about medical writing. So the only thing I did was listen. And I found that there was a lot of struggling with getting the results in the reports in the right way. And then GenAI came up, and I really started thinking, so why don't we utilize this much more, right? At the same time, more on the statistical side, you see that the diversity of data is increasing, right? So we're looking at clinical data, real world data, wearables. And also there, if you start thinking about how to utilize this data and making sure that you can make decisions based on this data, because I think that the availability of the data and our ability to derive action from that data really determines the success of drug development programs. And we need help with this. It gets very, very complex. And of course, with the start of the Gen AI, with AI in general, I think that we can do a lot more than we do today. And this is how I got started thinking about the tactical versus more strategic use of AI, and where could we use it? What are the challenges there, and how can we implement it in the drug development process? Not so much about the drug discovery, but the drug development process. And that's how I became interested in this field, and that's also how we met, Thomas. Right?
So I guess to start a higher level, then, how do you see, or I guess, how is AI, whatever AI means? Actually, yes, let's start with that. But in this question, how would you define AI? And given that definition, your definition, how do you see AI transforming the planning and the execution of clinical trials across the medical fields?
I can't really define AI, right? That's other people's other people's work. But how can it improve the work that we're doing? Now, if you think about detection of disease, for example, right? There's quite some research being done in breast cancer, where radiologists look at images and try to determine is there an issue for the particular woman, yes or no. Research has shown that by using AI on these images, you can really reduce the workload of the radiologists and also detect breast cancer, like tumors, earlier than it used to. So it has a real benefit. When you come to the drug development sphere, I think that the focus at the moment is much more tactical, right? Almost opportunistic, right? So, for example, I mentioned the medical writing field, right? One of the things that medical writers or in clinical study report or medical writers need to do is they write narratives, yeah, and especially in cancer, there's a lot of writing to do. It takes up a lot of time, and basically it's a rather standardized approach. And basically what they do is say this patient was so and so, this was the age, and this happened to the patient, right? It's all based on the data in the databases. Now, having AI can help you write these snippets much faster. Same with let's say statistical programming. Statistical programming. You need statistical program to provide tables, lists, and figures for a clinical study report. It's a lot of time. So can we automate this using AI? Yes, particular. So this is very, very tactical. It's basically focused on reducing the time and effort needed in a clinical trial. Now, I think that we need to start thinking much more strategically. So not only focusing on the specific task of a clinical trial, but focusing on a clinical program. And how can we determine the success of a clinical program? How can we move from phase 1 to phase 3 faster with more certainty that it works? Can we predict the outcome of clinical trials? Can we help determine the right population for a clinical trial or for a clinical program? If you do that, where do we find the patients? How can we increase the impact for the patients? That's a much more tactical use. And I think that's a discussion point that we need to start having much more than we have today.
What do you think, Amy, one thing we've also speak a lot about is the human element of organizations to enable, I guess, to have a culture that enables uses, whether it's strategic or tactical, of, let's say, unproven, untested, or just new technology. And I think one thing you like to refer to is that, quote unquote, not in my trial. How do you overcome, or how do you build as a leader the culture? And maybe if you can expand on what exactly you meant by that. How do you build culture in an organization?
Yeah, I think what you referred to was we've discussed this before, indeed. Basically, what I observe is that new methodology, new ideas. People welcome this, right? People see the challenges that we have in clinical development, and so generally people are very open to try new things. But then, if it comes to an important trial, the idea is, this is a great idea, let's do this, but not in my trial, because if anything goes wrong in my trial, that has a detrimental effect on many things, right, including the patients. So let's wait. I think it's super difficult to overcome, right? The discussions have to involve the decision makers in companies, clinicians, management. But we need to also involve the regulators, the policymakers, and I think that is tricky. Say that. How do you overcome that? I think that you have to create what we call psychologically safe space in your environment, right? So that people can try things out, and if they fail, we learn from that failure and move on. But it's a tricky balance between having a failure acceptance culture and spending a lot of money on a clinical development program that may go wrong, right? And as a leader, I think my task is to balance these risks, right? Look at the real risk. If things really go south, if it doesn't work out, is it repairable? Is it repairable fast? Or does that mean that basically you can start your program over, right? And if the latter, then it's maybe too risky, right? And you have to take smaller steps. As a leader, I would say take small steps and then increase the steps and then jump.
It's ultimately we spend all this effort on technologies, but the implementation of it is so much on the human side. On how do you ensure
and I think that one of the discussion points is always, how can we automate, right? So all the if you think about how to increase the speed in clinical trials, people think about standardization and automation, right? And that's fine. But then on the other hand, scientific progress is so fast that any standardization effort will not be able to keep up with that pace, with that scientific pace, right? So you need to balance that as well. I know people are thinking about processes with humans out of the loop. I think we're nowhere close, to be honest. You need people that interpret whatever AI is doing with the appropriate domain knowledge, right? Clinicians, statisticians, also programmers, who can help evaluate the risk of what is happening with respective algorithm. And I think that if you manage, if you can get humans and AI working a lot closer together and reduce the mistrust, I think that will be dramatically increasing the efficiency of what people are doing. So use it as a help, as your partner. So as in my case, as a statistician, as a second statistician, or a programmer, right? Let AI help you debug your programs. Let AI help you to find faster algorithms. I think that's where that needs to go now.
I really like what you're talking about here, because a lot of, especially programmers that I speak to, are mostly afraid around the question of, is AI, quote unquote, whatever AI means, going to replace us? And these days, it's usually a reference to an LLM or any LLM-based architecture. But what you're talking about is effectively how do you use a technology to enhance yourself, and there the LLM becomes effectively a human enhancement to get to a new way of working. And I always give the example of when, I think it was in 1998, when the IBM, what is it called, Deep Blue, I think it's called, beat Garry Kasparov in chess, and at the time, and afterwards, even though the machines had beaten Garry Kasparov, a new field emerged where in chess you can use computers with humans, and to this day there's not a single computer that has beaten the human and the computer. And I think I really like that, because that's the idea of how do you use a computer as Steve Jobs famously said, a bicycle for the mind, or a tool that humans can use to enhance the human experience. And I think that's a much better way of thinking about how can we replace a process.
Yeah, plus it will help people concentrate on what they do best, and that is, the more creative thinking process, right? If you think about LLMs, in the end, right, LLMs use data from the past to come to new ideas, basically, right? Humans do this differently. So if you manage to take away the more burdensome tasks from humans, from, say, programmers, right? They don't need to do all the tables and listings and figures that are rather standard in certain clinical trials, and concentrate on the more eminent questions on, what is new in this clinical trial? What is the scientific question? What do I need to bring up for a scientific discussion, both internally for decision making, but also for regulatory decision making, right? How can we help communities, regulators, decision makers within the company understand what needs to be done next? And a lot of effort now is going into rather mundane and standard tasks. Now, if we can get that away and make sure that people can concentrate on what matters most, that would be helpful. Like statisticians, if you look at the daily life of a statistician, quite a big part is in writing SAPs and checking data structures and things like that. If we can take that away and make sure that the statistician can really concentrate on designing the right clinical trial or the right strategy also in a clinical development program, how we move faster from early to late stage and to a submission, I think that would be really, really beneficial. So it basically helps people concentrate on where they matter most. Yeah.
So moving on a little bit from AI into other side of innovation, which is open source, which is the topic in statistical programming. I mean, SAS as a language is obviously established heavily in statistical programming, and it's sort of the default.
Yeah.
Actually, there was a story I wanted to share with you, if I haven't already done. But for our listeners, there was once an investor meeting where I very confidently asked if the person I was pitching to, if they knew SAS, and very confidently this person said that they knew SAS, and expecting them to actually know that I'm talking about a computer language, they said software as a service, right? And what was very interesting, the AA is that outside of these very regulated industries like statistical programming, SAS is a language that is not well known, and that makes it difficult, obviously, to hire good talent that doesn't come from this industry. So if we talk about open source or tooling, open source tooling in general, how do you see these contributing in the future for clinical trial analysis?
Yeah, there is a huge discussion ongoing in open source versus commercial software, right? And actually, I don't really want to chime in to that discussion, because I think that as a statistician, as someone's responsible in the end to design a study that's worth millions, I need certain tools, right? And I need the right tools to answer certain questions. And sometimes it is a commercial available software, be it sample size calculation, for example, simulation. And sometimes I find the answer in open source. And what you see is that companies who are, providing commercially providing software, that's how I say it, then they will actually open up now to include open source software, right? For example, SAS is opening up to include R language into their programs.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is. There's a lot of discussion also about costs, right? Some of the commercial software is very expensive, but then clinical trials are very expensive too, right? So that's, good software is expensive. Open source is also expensive, right? Not so much on, if you go on the internet and just get a package out and use it, but then making sure that that's working well, is reproducible, is validated, and works in an environment that we're working in, a very GCP, very controlled environment. That's then also a task that you need to work on, and that's expensive too. Right, so there's no free lunch. So either you spend the money here by buying the software, or you spend the money later by using the validation, etc. If you think more generally about open source, maybe we should get together as a industry and basically say this is what we need and this is what we need to do, and go from there. Yeah, the discussion open source or the commercial, I think that's a discussion we don't need to have that discussion as an industry. Basically, we just need to make sure that we do our work efficiently so that patients profit faster.
And the tooling is secondary to that always.
Yeah, the tooling is. I just need it. It's like a carpenter, right? They don't only have a hammer. They have different tools, and it's the same with a statistician. I don't only have SAS. I have R. I have Python, and certain software packages are more suitable for tasks than others, right? If you want to do AI, I think Python is one of the preferred packages. Some of the very, very advanced simulation parts, R can do a really great job. SAS has established great procedures. Look at the documentation for SAS; fantastic. Yeah. So everything has its advantages, and it would be great if we can, enable the packages to work together, work together more fluently, if you want, right? And that's what we see happening actually. And R can read SAS data. SAS can now include R language into their programs. So it is getting much more interconnected. Yeah.
In your experience, are you able to share any examples or one example of where you saw an innovation project executed correctly from start to finish, and one where it wasn't?
I have not seen any innovation project that just goes very smoothly from beginning to end. So innovation, of course. Well, innovation, someone said, is it's an idea times commercialization, right? Or if you are in a field like I am, the implementation, right? It's nice to have a great idea, but you have to be able to actually use it, right? Uh, but the innovation per se, of course, requires you to start rethinking on the way to your implementation, because you can have brilliant ideas, but then you find the technology maybe too slow to do it, so you have to cut down. I've never seen any project that just went from A to Z completely smooth. Never ever. Not in innovation. The challenge is how you deal with these mistakes and turnarounds and problems and challenges in general, right? So how do you deal with that? That is, I think, where the good separates from the great. Say that, yeah. Being able to adjust really fast, really quickly, and come to a good implementation. But yeah, as someone said, so it's basically a function of good ideas and implementation to get innovation. Good idea alone is great, but you need to implement it. So I can't give you an example, Thomas. Sorry.
And if you're,
I can give you loads of examples where good ideas completely failed. Let's not go into that, including some of my own, by the way. Right? So that's yeah. I think sometimes you have a great idea, but the time is not right for it, right? So,
right,
and I've seen that happening too, right? And that the time may not right because your organization, the organization that we're working with, is not ready to accept it. The time may not be right because the technology is not yet there, right? So you need to tweak the technology. So sometimes it's also just waiting a little bit. Yes.
Yeah. I mean that's excellent advice, and sometimes just important just to realize that it can't work. How do you coach upcoming leaders on how to make those decisions? Because they're tough. You have to say no at some point. You have to say yes, or you have to make a gut decision.
How do I coach? I try to lead by example. That's one thing, right? Every leader would say that. It's just being on my part, right? Not on the part of the one that is coached, like more the mental part. Just keep a very, very open mind. I think that as a leader, I have certain ideas. I have a vision. I know where I want to go. I know where I think the organization needs to go. And I think that part of the coaching is stepping away from your own comfort zone and saying, okay, what is the other one? What are their ideas? What are their strengths? And then help them develop these strengths rather than trying to even out their deficits. Right? And that I think that's what I do. Right? I focus on the strengths and say, okay, let's move there now. But coaching has a lot to do with leaving your own comfort zone rather than making sure that the other functions well. Because what does that mean, right? What does it mean if someone is successful?
Yeah.
How can you make someone successful? I don't think I can. That person can make him or herself successful, yes. And I can help with, questions. Say, have you thought about this? How would you address that? But most of the time, the answer comes from people themselves, right? So in the end, coaching is just asking a lot of stupid questions. That's what it is, right? And being nice about it. That's it. Not so much about giving advice, I think. Yeah.
But it is the trust ultimately that you give, because if you're asking the questions, implicitly there's the trust you're conveying because you're deferring to the other person in a real way, even though you may still be responsible.
Yeah, I think coaching without trust, you can't do that. And I think that has always been my aim, to create a trustful environment, a psychologically safe environment where people can speak their minds, where people can say, I hear what you're saying, Richard, but I just don't agree at all. And this is the reasons why. And if you have that as an organization, you will prosper, I'm sure.
In my experience, and I hate to say this, but I mean, well, I guess it's also a good thing because of statistical programming, clinical analysis is a very risk avoiding industry, and people that tend to, in my experience, that tend to advance are typically wouldn't really fit that profile, which in a way is also a good thing, because you're at that final stage of delivery. And so I think that's so important on how to balance those two things together, of that culture of making zero mistakes because you're nearing submission, but then that culture of innovation at the same time that goes a little bit sort of against that.
But this is exactly why you need a psychologically safe environment. So even let's skip the innovation for a moment, but let's assume that someone makes a mistake in the final stages of analysis. That's a disaster, right? Mm-hmm. If you have an unsafe environment, people wouldn't own up for it, and that would be even more disastrous for society, for patients, right? So you need to create an environment that, if something goes wrong, people can say, wait, this is a mistake, we need to redo this. And yes, it takes time, and yes, it's not going to be nice. So it has real consequences, monetary consequences. But you have to create an environment where this is possible, because otherwise you're literally doomed. Because if people are afraid to acknowledge that there is a mistake, then decisions are being made on faulty interpretation of data. That's disastrous.
Yeah.
So I think that is what I find very important. If you think about, like, leadership, what's the most important thing is creating a psychologically safe environment, indeed.
So my final question, Richard, for today, hopefully to end, I hope at least on a positive note, is in general in life, people tend to usually overestimate what they can do in 1 year's time, but tend to underestimate what they can do in 5 or even 10 years.
Yes.
How do you see the next 5 to 10 years of clinical trials?
I think there's like a lot of discussion in clinical development and in the industry, what is going to happen with clinical trials, etc. Right? So I'm a statistician, so I can't change that. I really believe in randomized, double-blind clinical trials. It's that way. However, I think that using AI, GenAI, will just help streamline the way we do our clinical trials. Right? I think that by making more and more data available for very early decision making, for the planning, if we can use that more, and if we can integrate data that is available from other sources into our clinical trials, I think it will speed up. It does require, though, a completely different setup of the processes, a different strategy. And I think that in 5 to 10 years, we will be there. So yes, it will be faster, it will be better, it will be good for the patients, I'm sure. Is that positive enough, Thomas?
I think so. I think so. Is there anything else you
Yeah.
would like to wish to leave our listeners to before we wrap up the episode, Richard?
Well, keep an open mind, be kind, share your knowledge. There's an abundance of knowledge, so live, share your knowledge in abundance, and keep doing the good work. I think that's what we need to do.
Beautiful. Well, Richard, you've been super generous with your time. Thank you so much again for coming
No
on the
problem.
podcast. And I hope we can speak again, and maybe we can do a part 2 as new technology progresses.
That would be great. Thanks, Thomas. Thanks for having me, and I really enjoyed our conversation. So thanks for that.